Welcome everyone to another Saturday night satsang. Just a reminder that there'll be the next satsang in 2 weeks' time on the 27th of July. So feel free to join then as well. And before we get into it, the 3-week retreat in Bali has registrations have opened for that. And I think that's going to be a great meeting of friends over 3 weeks in a beautiful place with great activities, good food. So anyone who feels called to join, also very welcome. The details are on the website. I was speaking with a friend this week, and I know that they were going through or are going through some tricky circumstance in a number of areas of their life. And they've been interested in seeking for many years. However, I think they would be the first to admit that other things tend to take priority, and those other things often have outcomes attached to them. And so when I say other things take priority, the tendency is for there to be a focus on getting somewhere. And then when life does get a bit difficult and things get turned on their head and the plan, is no longer as achievable or obvious as we might have hoped, then that's when the uncomfortableness really kicks in. Not that it isn't there when things are going, reasonably well. There's always going to be circumstance that triggers various forms of suffering until such time as that identity has dissolved, and then there isn't. But it's times when there's major upheavals that it becomes obvious that there needs to be, or that there isn't, a stable foundation on which to fall back into. And when that becomes obvious, then that's when there is a yearning and a motivation to put attention into maybe a sort of more sustainable, a more real solution. And knowing my friend, I sort of sent a couple of messages here and there just in support, and also hopefully some guidance if that was wanted. And I suspected that the movement would be, the mental movement would be to try and sort out the circumstance, to try and find direction where direction was lost, or try to regain certain areas of life that were sliding away. And once again, that movement is the idea that that's the problem. That's where the uncomfortableness is coming from, that the uncomfortableness is there because there isn't certainty, or there isn't positive outcome in various areas. And so the hint that I suggested, it was that we really need to ask a question like, who am I? Rather than habitually and instinctively looking to solve the problem as we assume is the best way, i.e. automatically going out to try and fix circumstance. And rightly so, the question came back. It's like, why the question, who am I? Is it because that will lead you to your true self, or a recognition of the true self? And I said yes, something like that. And they replied saying, so in practice, what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to sit there all day just repeating, who am I, who am I, who am I? And he added, because the problem is the gap between an intellectual understanding that there is a true self, and that true self is less inclined to suffer, less inclined or not inclined to feel uncomfortable with itself, and uncomfortable and threatened by the uncertainty and the outcomes or lack thereof. The problem is between the intellectual understanding and something deeper, something that translates into an experiential change in how one knows oneself and how one subsequently then relates to and feels about oneself in life. And so it's a very good question. And so the response was, no, you're not meant to sit there just repeating, who am I? And as we know, the idea that there is a true self, or the various concepts that say, what I really am is consciousness, or not the body, or that my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, those concepts, it's sort of water off a duck's back when suffering is there, and the concepts are just used as intellectual pieces of information. Something different needs to happen in the process of seeking. And how that happens is by a seeker genuinely finding that they are interested in moving down an inquiry, moving down an investigation, spending time looking and being interested. Now, that motivation is not something that we dictate. We might want to be motivated, but the truth is, if you become aware of a time when you really are not motivated to do something, you'll find it's virtually impossible to do it. The lack of motivation means we will turn away very easily. Now, if motivation happens to be there, it isn't that we are deciding to be interested. Motivation is something that arises. And the question, who am I, or for that matter, many other concepts that might be delivered in a teaching, but let's focus on who am I. It's a question. And if a seeker hears from a teaching that who am I is a relevant question, then hopefully what happens is there is an interest in the working mind. It says, oh, that's an interesting question. Who am I? And it then moves on from the question to another point of contemplation. So it's like, okay, where do I start? Does it mean, who do I think I am? Does it mean, who am I really? And is it wanting me to just say, oh, answer it based on book information? Like, oh, I know better than to say I am the body. So I'll say the answer to who am I is I am consciousness. Now, that's not really the that's not what takes us deeper. If we find an interest in the question, we might say, okay, where do I start? We can go to our experience and answer it from experience. And we say, okay, well, at least from experience, I feel like I am a person in a world. And we might then find that a teaching says, well, what about thinking? What about your thinking? Is your thinking, or is thinking relevant to the answer or an understanding of who am I? Who are you without your thoughts? Or what role do your thoughts play in your experience of yourself? Or do your thoughts / desires make up part of who you know yourself as? And we might then find ourselves being interested in thought as a component that we might realize, yes, thinking, I will be driving and I might be thinking about things that I want or that I did or didn't do well or not well. And so an interest in the thoughts, their content, the different types of thoughts, is a continuation of this question, who am I, that just starts a movement. Now, if we find ourselves asking that question, being interested for 10 minutes and then being caught up with something that's happening on the radio and then a phone call and not going back to any contemplation, that's quite feasible. That would be what I would say is destiny unfolding, and it's destined for that person to find that their interest just isn't sustained. It doesn't seem relevant. For some, the thinking just moves from one point to the next, fueled by talks that people listen to online, YouTube, books that someone might be reading, quotes on Facebook that are posted by all sorts of people, all of which that might give us something to think about. What does that quote mean? What is it pointing at? And as we get some insight about a topic that we didn't understand prior to thinking, because thinking actually reveals, thinking delivers an understanding about something that before we thought about it, we simply understood less. And the more we look at a topic, the more information we get about it, the more things we see or components we see about the topic we're looking at, the more we understand. And understanding then feeds into more understanding. And that really is the process of the understanding going deeper and deeper and deeper. Now, I'm sure many of you have seen that the concepts of non-doership are descriptions of life that are not really commonplace. And so they get us to think, they get us to observe for ourselves. And that observation goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And if we're lucky, we'll find ourselves interested in the topic every day, listening to a talk, wanting to read something. And after a year or 2 years, 10 years, we're bound to understand more of the playing field than we did before. Now, hopefully, we go beyond absorbing information just for the sake of information, but rather find that the information leads us to a direct seeing of the life circumstance. Like the information is pointing us to see the dynamics that are being described. And this notion of no doer eventually leads us to an investigation of thinking. Thinking is a significant step along the way to the actions that happen. We find that usually an action is preceded by a thought. And the concept of non-doership say that our thoughts are not something that someone creates, but rather a consequence of our particular makeup, our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And as we see through the apparent concreteness of thoughts, thoughts at first feel like the alive part of who I am, the active part, the controller, the dictator, the reason why things happen. And the assumption is that if there is a thought, there must be a thinker of the thought. And as we look at thoughts as they arise and see that they come out of nothing, meaning in the experience, in the present moment experience, a thought appears. It wasn't there before. Comes out of nothing means, is there anywhere that any of the present moment stems from? Or is it a spontaneous arising out of what we can call is prior to the experience, nothing, and it then materializes as the experience? And looking at thinking leads us to see not only are we not the doers, but there really is nobody here. There is no one that we can call the subject. So the notion of non-doership actually, as it develops, reveals something quite esoteric and quite profound, that there is a sense of existence. There is an awareness that is aware of whatever is happening in the moment. But that awareness, that existence, doesn't belong to a form, doesn't exist after a thought, for example. It doesn't come out of the body and it doesn't come out of thoughts. That is something that gets revealed as the thoughts and the body are seen to be consequences, seen to be happenings, which is not the starting point. The usual starting point is the sense, the belief, the assumption that the body and the thoughts are what I am. And so a realization of this nature is very destabilizing to the existing structure. It weakens the structure of belief. And as insights like this happen, the psychological self tends to weaken, and that's when we find suffering starts to become less consistent, more easily cut off, and of a weaker duration, weaker intensity. Eventually, what we find is that we don't even do the cutting off. that we just look back on the week, the month, or the year, and we realize that the various forms of suffering, the guilt, the blame, the expectation, the worry, the regret, the complaining, just haven't arisen. They've stopped. And so that delivers an even deeper understanding of the non-doership. The non-doership is, in that regard, the thoughts are just not happening. So if they don't happen, then there definitely can't be a doer of something that didn't happen. And so the notion of non-doership, as we observe it and as it changes, so as it changes, we observe the change. And our understanding of non-doership does change and deepen to the point where eventually seeking itself becomes something that doesn't need to happen. The seeking itself falls away because it becomes irrelevant. For as long as the suffering is taking place, then the seeking will automatically carry on. But when the suffering gets to a point that it is either not happening or considered by the system irrelevant, then the seeking itself falls away. I was intending for today's satsang to be one primarily of question and answers. There hasn't been too much time for that in some of the previous talks. So if anyone has any questions that they'd like to discuss, it's a small group today. So feel free to raise your electronic hand and we'll be able to go through that. In the meantime, I'll talk about the difference between biological and psychological reactions. One of the consequences of attachment to outcome, which is part of the psychological identity. Attachment to outcome is usually attachment to pleasure and aversion to pain, meaning not a biological aversion to pain and movement towards pleasure, but a psychological aversion and a psychological attachment, meaning the belief that pleasure is much more than it actually is in reality. Reality is pleasure is pleasurable, but it's not going to deliver ongoing happiness. Our attachment to outcomes is the deeply ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And so then there is a psychological craving, what Buddhism would refer to as desire. And a consequence of that is the belief that enlightenment is going to deliver perfection, that enlightenment is going to deliver a saint, make us immune from getting angry or irritable, immune from making mistakes. And so along the way, we tend to resist any of those sort of things, feeling like they are proof that what we're really looking for hasn't eventuated. And this is where we need to understand the difference between the psychological suffering that extends horizontally in time versus the biological reaction, which extends vertically in time. So a biological reaction is a reaction of the body and mind to a particular circumstance. That response is not necessarily going to be a response of harmony. When looked at from the outside, someone might say, well, that person isn't at peace with the circumstance because they are in reaction to something where they're clearly not happy. They're angry, for example. And the deeper understanding must realize that my unhappiness is not the momentary response to a situation. The momentary response to the situation will be exactly according to our biological structure and our body-mind organism, even after the point where the psychological self has fallen away. The body-mind organism is going to have its biological characteristics, its personality, and its preferences. And biologically, the body will resist pain and it will be attracted to pleasure. That doesn't change, and that biological attraction towards pleasure, movement towards pleasure, and movement away from pain is not the same thing as attachment to outcome. It isn't what is meant by attachment to outcome or desire as used in the Buddhist context, which really means attachment to outcome, where we believe that our happiness is dependent on outcomes. The biological reaction will continue to be there even after attachment to outcomes has fallen away, meaning the body will continue to have its preferences, its biological preferences. It will therefore continue to prefer, let's say, having a hot shower than a cold shower. It might prefer having sweet foods rather than savory foods. And it will move towards its preference when the preference is available. However, the biological preference doesn't equate to an insistence that the preference is delivered in life. The biological preference understands that life is not always going to deliver its preference. And because there is a preference, there will be a biological reaction to the circumstance. And that biological reaction could be one of resistance or reaction to pain. So we might make a noise. The body might be in pain and make a noise. That is a biological reaction. The body might defend itself. It might become aggressive as a form of defense or as a form of irritation or anger at a certain preference not being delivered. Now, as long as that response is circumstantial and momentary and doesn't extend horizontally, according to the framework, that is not psychological resistance, but biological resistance. And if that biological resistance happens and it extends for a few seconds, 10, 15 seconds, a minute even, it's really not that problematic as long as the psychological suffering doesn't then jump on board, claim ownership over that response, include an idea, I shouldn't have got angry, I shouldn't have these biological responses. And if that happens, we then start on the extended suffering that can turn a 1 minute interaction that might be painful, because anger is not pleasurable, so it's a biological pain in the moment, and it can turn that into hours of contemplation and thinking about why the other person acted the way they did, or why we acted the way we did, and why we shouldn't have done that. And that turns 1 minute into 300 minutes. And that's the suffering. If we don't have this distinction, what we have is this expectation, which is the basis of a lot of suffering, an expectation based on an attachment to outcome that we are perfect in various ways. And that expectation often comes from an idea that enlightenment must mean peace of mind, or that enlightenment is peace of mind, and a misunderstanding that momentary reactions are not aligned with peace of mind. And as long as we're at peace with the momentary reaction, meaning we're not confused, or we're not regretful, we're not ashamed at the momentary response. We understand it was inevitable. We understand it's biological and it makes sense. In the same way as if a liberated being loses someone that they love, finds out that a friend has died, we wouldn't necessarily expect them to be emotionless. The sadness, a tear might come to one's eyes, or you might have a cry. That doesn't mean a resistance with life. It means a biological response to the circumstance. And the suffering is either there or not there, depending on how we feel about ourselves and about the situation over an extended period of time. If thoughts of a certain sort simply don't arise, even if sadness continues to arise periodically through the day or over the next weeks, that sadness, when we look at it, may well be a biological sadness where our sense of self is not diminished or covered up by the presence of that sadness. And we, in fact, see that the sadness is based on an appreciation of what that person played, what role they played in our life, what they delivered, what we were able to experience as a result of the friendship. And we find that it's based on love and not on a sense of loss at the level of oneself. So feelings like anger and sadness are not necessarily a disturbance of one's peace of mind. And if we can understand that, then when the biological reactions happen, there'll be an acceptance of them. So if you look at examples of sages in history, we see Nisargadatta, who was extremely irritable. He'd kick people out of satsang because they'd ask questions that he considered inappropriate, or he'd say, well, I've answered this so many times, I think it's time for you to leave. And he would get angry and irritable, and yet he would be able to laugh in the next moment, maybe even with the person that he was angry with just a second before. You've got even examples like Ramana Maharshi, who needed to take medication for asthma, I think. And so his attendant would often remind him that he needed to take his medication. And there were quite a few times, as recorded in various accounts, where he would get irritable and annoyed at the attendant for pestering him to take the medication when he didn't want to. And he also would get irritable and angry at various staff in the ashram if the kitchen staff weren't keeping certain cleanliness standards. Then there would be a biological reaction. And so it's very important for us to see this in sages that we admire and that we respect and have a trust and a resonance with, so that our understanding then can try and reconcile this, which means it reconciles our understanding so that it more appropriately aligns with what actually happens in practice. Now, Nisargadatta would not feel a sense of shame for having a short temper, and the same for Ramana Maharshi. In that situation, we have accounts of Jesus at certain times getting angry, when the traders were using temple as a marketplace. There's an account of him turning over the tables and chastising the traders for not having respect. And if I'm not mistaken, in that very story, he ends up having a meal with the very traders that evening after this display of anger. And that just shows that it wasn't considered personal. There wasn't a grudge held. It happened, and then he was able to move on and relate to them in a civil way. So we should ask ourselves this question: what are we really looking for? If we get clarity on that in this teaching, yes, it's enlightenment might be the term, but in practice, enlightenment means peace of mind in daily living, regardless of the circumstance. So does that mean no reaction, no painful reaction to the circumstance? No, it means there will be a reaction to the circumstance according to our biological makeup. And as long as our attitude towards the reaction is an attitude of non-doership, then that means that there won't be any involvement in the biological reaction. So it means no involvement in the biological reaction, which means no suffering, meaning the attitude of non-doership is what is at play, meaning anger happened and there was the absence of the attitude of personal doership. The absence of the attitude of personal doership means the non-happening of the various forms of suffering, like shame at getting angry or regret at getting angry. Now, that absence of the psychological shame or regret doesn't mean that there won't be a subsequent biological movement of apologizing. If we see that the biological reaction, because of our temperament, for example, is not optimal, is maybe making someone feel upset, then as a result, given that that's not our intention, it was a biological reaction, automatically could be, I'm sorry for overreacting. It's not really about what was expressed in the biological reaction. And so that might at first seem like an apology doesn't make sense if we believe ourselves or see ourselves not to be the doers. It's like, well, that happened. But in the same way, if we see that that biological reaction is not optimal, we can't change it, but we can apologize for it or acknowledge that it's not optimal. Having said that, it doesn't mean that an apology is necessarily going to be forthcoming all the time in those circumstances. It will all be as it will be, as it's destined to be. And the attitude of non-doership witnesses whatever is happening happen as a happening according to God's will or cosmic law. And more specifically, we can say God's will, cosmic law, is unfolding, firstly, through the expression of one's genes and up-to-date conditioning, and the circumstance, and the combination of genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance leads to the biological reaction and any subsequent psychological reaction. So if a psychological reaction of suffering happens in relation to a circumstance, meaning if an attitude of doership kicks in or arises and is involved in the biological reaction, then hopefully, potentially, the attitude of non-doership kicks in at some point and sees that even the psychological response is a happening according to one's genes and up-to-date conditioning. Understanding that we then don't call the psychological happening, which is based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning, but we don't call that a biological response, but rather a response based on the psychological self, a response based on the ingrained beliefs of personal doership and attachment to outcomes, which also comes under the umbrella of a consequence of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so that attitude of non-doership can kick in relation to the involvement in the circumstance. So involvement in the circumstance is the primary suffering. If we get involved in the primary suffering, we have then secondary suffering. So we have the biological reaction in the moment, the primary suffering, the secondary suffering, and there could be tertiary suffering. And at whatever point the attitude of non-doership kicks in, then that is where the suffering ceases. It will continue on, let's say, the primary level, the primary involvement, but doesn't turn into secondary involvement, or the secondary involvement gets cut off. And then that attitude of non-doership might even cut off the primary involvement. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
Hi. So let me see if I can formulate this more clearly. Sorry if I sound a little strange. It's because it's very, very early in the morning here in California, and I'm still in bed. But it's nice to wake up to hearing the truth so clearly articulated. Um,
Thank you.
I think I can say pretty clearly that um, that my understanding is penetrating more and more deeply, and a tremendous gratitude wells up um, quite frequently, um, because I can see how the secondary suffering and all its consequences, tertiary, quaternary, and so on and so forth, is less and less present. Um, and and um, and even the experience of the primary suffering of biological experience um, is takes on a different flavor. It it may be, for example, I'll be very clear. Uh, um, Recently, I had an episode of a very intense pain, biological pain, um, uh, that I've had before. It's a back spasm.
Mhm.
Not a not a life-threatening experience, but a very, very intense pain. And
Mhm.
uh, and I found myself going through it differently than I had uh, in the past. And one thing that I found was that uh, by having less of the secondary and so on pains.
Melissa, let me just jump in because the primary
Okay.
suffering is not the biological suffering. So just
Okay.
so we'll just correct. There's the biological suffering, which is the pain. Then the primary suffering would be involvement in the biological,
Ah, I see.
right?
Okay.
Just
Thank you.
let's just to clear that up. Yep. So
Yes.
you're
Yes.
saying that you were able to just be very differently with the
The
biological pain. Yeah.
biological. Right. Right.
Yeah.
Sorry. That moved me one step closer. I mean, just by clarifying the terminology. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So yes, I would say that the primary suffering was was almost non-existent. Um,
Mhm.
it was just feeling the biological pain very intensely, and it went on for many hours. So it wasn't just a short. You know, I don't know. You may not have ever had a back spasm, but they
Mhm.
can be very, very intense. But 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 one thing that I noticed was that by not having the primary and so on sufferings, that
Mhm.
it seemed as if my something was freed up by,
Mhm.
if you will, perhaps my mind was freed in a way that I could find a solution to the experience much more quickly than I've been able to do in the past. And so the 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 time period and even the depth of the pain was in that, even the biological component of it was altered, and it was quite remarkable for me to see that. And then so this was just a few days ago, and then subsequent to the pain being able to be alleviated, uh, a, a new insight arose that I'm hoping may actually turn out to be a solution to the arising of the pain in the first place, which has to do with the need to do more stretching. I do a lot of exercise, but I almost never do any stretching, and my extensors, the back and the extensor muscles are very stiff. And it may be that something as simple as that may turn out to be, we'll have to see, but it may turn out to be a solution to something that has been a recurrent source of pain. And I'm kind of marveling at how the experience of life can perhaps transform in such a way. And and it reminds me of something that one of my other teachers has mentioned to me, that when we come to this recognition, realization of the truth about reality, that even our karma, our prarabdha, our karma may change, may pieces of it may drop away. And that kind of blows my mind. So I wonder if you might be able to say something about that, please.
Well, as far as back pain goes, I know that when it's very intense, we think surely this must be a really big problem. And I was amazed by going to a physiotherapist that they can suggest something as small as stretching that can fix something that's so painful. And I never would have thought that there was a fix for it because the pain was so intense. So hopefully this is what happens. The body karma will always be there, but it's not necessarily always going to be the same. Like any destiny, if suddenly we take a complete right turn, where we say, "Oh, I'm going to do things differently," that is the unfolding of our destiny. So I would say that right turn was always destined to happen. And so the fact that life is destined doesn't mean that we're forced in a consistent direction. We are forced in a consistent direction, and that direction is whatever destiny is, which means that sharp right turn that we might take that seems like we have now changed our destiny is actually a continuation of our destiny. So the body karma will always be there, which includes potentially the end of a certain type of, or a certain phase of the body karma, which means the body can go from a phase of pain into a phase of no pain. And that is a continuation of the body karma. It's just that it's changed from pain to no pain, for example. And as far as body karma is concerned, sages like Nisargadatta and Ramana have sometimes said after liberation, even one's body karma ends. What they mean is not that the body ceases to have its karma, but that there is no one to claim ownership over that ongoing karma of
Yes.
the body. So they say you are free even from the body karma. Not that there won't be pain, but that there will be no one claiming ownership over the pain. There'll be no one there to claim ownership over it. And that really is much more about, rather than us expecting some special sort of experience, it's much more akin to what you describe, where there is just the pain and there is no involvement in it. And the end of involvement in the pain means a deep understanding that this is inevitable, this is life. And with that deep understanding that this is life, this is karma, it is biological, there's a silence. And in that silence, there's no one there. Well, there's no one that used to be there. And that is the freedom that's spoken about.
Thank you. That that uh, that that brought me back again to the framework, um, and seeing more clearly how it is put together, rather than the rather wishy-washy way that I had put it, that somehow that the destiny disappears. Of course, it couldn't. That's impossible, because there is, I mean, even as the Buddha pointed out, that causes and conditions uh, give rise to outcomes. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Although causes and conditions are always changing, and even if there is a line of causes and conditions leading up to this present moment, the responses to this present moment change the causes and conditions for the next moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I see where a a a, a process of in, increasing freedom can arise. Sorry, it overwhelms me when I think about it.
Yes, I understand.
So, one other question, if there aren't other questions, if I could ask, it's related to this.
Mm-hmm.
That that I was pondering, from some weeks ago, a previous satsang that you gave. It might have been at the end of May. That where where that this uh, this concept of that, that the that that the destiny, although there is no personal doer, that the destiny has a kind of a it maybe just inherent in the word destiny has a kind of a fixity, a fixed sound to it, a fixed implication to it, um, and that uh, my understanding of infinite consciousness beingness, this sat chit of reality. My understanding of it is that it is infinitely free. That that the more closely that we can identify with that infinite doer that is actually our we're of course never separated from it, and less identified with the conditioned parent body mind, that that is a part of the freedom, that's part of that's a component of how the freedom becomes more and more available. That it got me to thinking that it reminded me of the difference between the quantum level, what modern science is pointing to as the quantum level, where there nothing is fixed, where it's all spontaneous arising, spontaneous appearance and disappearance, versus the level of the whatever we might call this, the macro level, that seems to have causes and conditions associated. And it got me wondering if maybe as we move deeper and deeper in our understanding, that in a sense we come closer to that quantum, to that quantum uh, uh, quantum realm, so to speak, rather than the macro level, or the macro realm. I mean, it's just amusing. I wonder if you might say
Yeah,
something about that.
yeah. I think that if we identify as formless awareness, then or rather source. So if we were to just go with the theory that all there is source, and therefore we are that, and
Yes.
source is the creator, then we are not bound, but we are the creator. So
Yes.
we have ultimate freedom. However, that's mainly theoretical. Where it's not theoretical is when there is an abiding as formless awareness or witnessing happening. And from that perspective, we transcend destiny in the sense that we transcend the circumstance. We've transcended the body. And in those moments of witnessing, and they can extend, then we can say we are no longer bound by destiny, because destiny is the unfolding of the flow of life. And as formless awareness, we are not that. We are free. We are formless. So we're the witness. However, I feel that this life, actually, after awakening to the consciousness aspect, which will include an abiding as formless awareness for extended periods of time as part of the familiarization with that component of life, that which is clearly the subject, the true subject, then there is a living as if, or living as the the human. So I would describe life as ultimately coming full circle, where we live as the human being, including that means living as the body that is destined to fulfill its destiny. So when we live as the human being, the freedom is not there in a way where we can control or create our destiny. But that doesn't matter, because there is a freedom from involvement in destiny, which is the important freedom. That's the freedom that is that reveals the underlying contentment and wholeness that exists, irrespective of the lack of freedom of controlling circumstance. And if we go back to the theory, we can say, ultimately, when all of this comes to an end, we are free, and we've always been free. And so there never was any lack of freedom.
Thank you. I'm just so completely full of gratitude for the fullness of the, if you will, of the circle coming full circle. How profound it is, just takes my breath away. So I think I have to, I can't really speak much anymore, but thank you so much. That really answered all of my questions for now. Thank you, Roger.
Very good. You're welcome, Melissa. Hi, Ranko.
Hi, Roger. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Very nice. It seems that
Good.
I cannot turn the camera on, but it is all right.
Okay. Oh, apparently you can. Yes, there you go.
Yeah, in the last satsang, there was a few words about blueprint. And I think
About what, sorry?
About blueprint. What is our blueprint?
Oh, yes.
Blueprint. And I think I do not understand that term very well. So is it just our genes and up-to-date conditioning, or is it
Yes.
just more broad term? Because there are experiences like past life experience, which seems coming from the past. So is it on the umbrella of genes, or is it something special? And there are also like experiences like strange dreams, which seems that they are not connected with anything, but usually they come with a message. So they are also kind of a conditioning. And is in this umbrella of blueprint also, and what is the relationship between those?
Yeah, so the terms are not meant to be sort of overly scientific. So when we talk about genes and up-to-date conditioning, we're not necessarily talking about specifically the genes, but rather whatever it is. And I think the genes are, if we're broad enough in our understanding, we'll say, okay, the genes are what create the physical body in its entirety. So the physical structure, and then the physical structure doesn't exist independent of up-to-date conditioning. And so if we are influenced by, let's say, something like things that happened in the past prior to our birth, that would be a form of up-to-date conditioning. or that would be part of your up-to-date conditioning. So the word up-to-date conditioning is the cumulativeness of all conditioning that life delivered, all new conditioning that life delivered. So in each moment, life is delivering new conditioning, moment after moment after moment. New doesn't necessarily mean different. Doesn't mean different from, the week before, but it is new conditioning in each moment, and it can be radically different. And so the cumulativeness of all of that new conditioning as it exists in our system is what I would call the up-to-date conditioning that is not separate, essentially, from the genetic structure. In science, that I think is referred to as your epigenetics. Is the epigenetics is the fact that the genes are actually influenced by the circumstance and the environment. But anyway, it's not really meant to be an overly scientific explanation, but rather just an umbrella term that says we will function according to the body and all of its programming. So if we did have something left over from another life, not necessarily Ranko's life, but John or Mary, if somehow a John or a Mary lived and some of their experience is in your system, that is part of your up-to-date conditioning. And it will play out in your experience, in your behavior, in your response to life. It will be part of what dictates what happens. So if you have certain dreams, the theory says the dream is happening because of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. You might not be aware of, you might not be able to trace it yourself. But if it's happening, the theory says it's happening because of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. However, we could also include an aspect where you get a message, let's say, something comes from outside. Then, so Einstein has said, the formula E equals mc squared came to him from outside. Ramesh said he got a message that came to him from outside. Now, outside doesn't necessarily mean it is not part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, because a message that seems like it comes from outside can also be explained as it only was able to be there because of a structure being exactly the way it is. So I don't know that I would look at it as being independent of genes and up-to-date conditioning. I think that at least attitudinally, so it isn't so much important, it's the implication. The implication is if it happens according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors that I wasn't in control of, then it is a happening. If it comes from outside, it's a happening. And so the attitude is whatever happens, it's a happening and not my doing. So if it comes from outside, if you get information from outside, definitely not your doing. And then when you respond to it, you are responding based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance. You could say that if you get information from outside, it is part of the circumstance. a bit like someone else giving you information.
Yeah, that experience really looks like it is coming from outside. And what I interpreted, it is like it is from my subconscious. And subconscious is something that I cannot see, that I cannot understand. But in a way, I always thought about subconscious that it has to have some relationship with my life, with my conscious life, everyday life.
Mhm.
And those experiences really looks like they are not connected.
So I would say that our subconscious is very much influenced by our life, by, let's say, our up-to-date conditioning. But that up-to-date conditioning is not necessarily something you'll remember. There can be up-to-date conditioning when you were a child or a baby that you're not familiar with. But especially if there is some sort of link from other lives, not necessarily Ranko's other life, but lives that happened. And then that information somehow is, because of cosmic law, there is information transfer into your system. Now you will then get that information potentially. It might be available to you, but you will have no understanding where it has come from. But if it's come from another life, then that, to me, definitely fits into the category of up-to-date conditioning, but you're not aware of what that up-to-date conditioning is.
Yeah, because maybe we are not so aware of our complexity. Human beings much more complex than usually we think it is. And we are
Yes.
thinking in terms. So genes and up-to-date conditioning looks to me that they are independent, different, but basically it is the same thing. Just trying to explain. An explanation is just trying to explain the complexity, which cannot be explained.
Yeah, exactly. So if we go to complexity, another way is you have your conscious mind, and then which probably the conscious mind understands life in a fairly rudimentary way. There's another part of ourselves that maybe processes life in a much more with much more understanding beyond anything that we are aware of. So I would be completely on board with an explanation that says we probably have no idea how things are really happening and what intelligence is really running the show. From the teaching point of view, what is important is that the movements that we are aware of, meaning our actions, our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings, attitudinally, we need to say, this is not something I am controlling. And so even if those things aren't coming from genes and up-to-date conditioning, if there is something much more complex or mysterious creating all of those things, our liberation, our freedom doesn't come from understanding, the science of what is running all of that, or the meta science. It simply comes from a surrender to the fact that life is happening. And so, yeah, I would say that if something very complex is happening, that's a great example of the fact that if we don't even understand it, it's definitely not the conscious part of us doing it. So this attitude of non-doership again we can go, great, I can apply that and understand it to be not necessarily because of genes and up-to-date conditioning. That's just one way of describing it. It could be another mechanism, completely different mechanism, but still the important attitude is that of it's just happening.
Yeah, so basically how we navigate with its complexity. There's this whole inner feeling. In each moment, do what you feel you want to do. So that is the only basic navigational mechanism. And then it is important to get rid of the doership for that mechanism to smoothly operate.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Thank you. I understand better.
Thank you, Ranko. Hi, Catherine.
Can you hear me now? Hi.
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. I'll just see if I can turn my camera on. I don't. Oh, there I am. Okay. Hi. I'm still processing so much with the intensive last week, and it's just been really opening up some beautiful pathways that I had originally when I had my first awakenings, and then it kind of went away. And of course, you opened up those pathways again, and with some beautiful questions that come to me. I love the fact that you use the terminology, the great ordainer. I haven't heard that by very many people other than the Catholic religion, which I was very deeply conditioned in growing up. I mean, going to church almost every day during Lent and confession once a week, and right up till I was 18. I used to make up sins to the priest just because I thought his life was so boring that I would just make stuff up, because I didn't understand how a 6-year-old could actually be having sins, right? So I knew that the religion was going to not work for me as I got older. But now I'm coming back to using that word, the great ordainer, because as a Catholic, that only meant a priest or a bishop. And I had lots of those people around me all the time. My family was raised to actually make priests and nuns. And, that's what we were to do. We were raised to become those things. So that was impossible to be that perfect. My question is around the clarity you're using in witnessing, because that was so powerful for me when you explained it just again this morning, was that is such a powerful first step. And I forgot how powerful it is. The cutting off of suffering and moving to witnessing is instant cutting off of suffering. I mean, it's just like, I don't want to spend any more time thinking about anything else or trying to figure anything else, but just staying right there. And I don't know if you're dyslexic. Do you have are you on the spectrum at all in terms of pathways, neural pathways?
I'm not dyslexic as far as I know. I use numbers. I might be on the spectrum, but not the dyslexic spectrum.
Okay, because I'm dyslexic, and so in a lot of the learning processes, I have a problem when it gets down to the details, like the very, very, very small details. Big thinking, I can get it very quickly. I was a social worker for years, but then I moved over to becoming an interior designer because I enjoyed the big thinking. I could walk into a room and just look at a room, and everything would kind of just get up and float around and find its proper place. I didn't do anything. I thought, how can I do that? And then I found out dyslexics do that. They're big thinkers, but they really have a problem when it comes down to numbers. And I can't read a map, for instance. So when I get to the left and right and the little details, I absolutely give up. I have to surrender to that. And I've learned to surrender so many times in when the details start happening. And so in your teaching, you just go up into the big thinking all the time, to the big picture. And you keep saying, don't worry about it. Stop thinking about it. You're overthinking this. You need to just be in the witnessing. See, there's a witnessing. And I thought, oh my God, this is like perfect for me. This pathway that you just was open at one time, then closed and then reopened again, is making so much sense. And maybe to other dyslexics, they would see it that way too, that you're able to just say, go back into the big thinking and just look at it all from a distance, and everything will find its place. Stop worrying about it. Stop trying to figure it out, because dyslexics go crazy and that stuff, right? So I just wanted to let you know that and what the feeling I got very distinctly as a witness was in your falling back. When you use the term falling back. And again, I remember my first awakening was the feeling of falling back. It wasn't a non-dual teacher, but he simply said, everybody just close your eyes and imagine you're standing on a ledge and turn your back on the edge of this abyss, and you're going to allow yourself to fall off of it backwards. And let's see what happens. And first of all, you had to really experience a fear of what that was, to actually be on a cliff backwards going to fall off. It was terrifying. And you had to allow yourself, don't push yourself or anything, but it will just happen. Might be whatever it is, maybe a little breeze will come along in your imagination or something, but off you go. And the minute I fell off was a minute that I fell into this great awareness of, wow. And so I just wanted to tell you, those are the two big openings I got this week, was your sense of the great ordainer, which I feel you're very...
That was me repeating one of Ramana's ultimate summations, where he says everything happens according to the great ordainer. The body will have its karma, and whatever is destined to happen in the universe, no matter how great a force in the universe tries to stop it from happening, it will happen. Yes. No matter what is not destined to happen, no matter what force in the universe tries to make it happen, it will not happen. So understanding this, the best course of action is to remain silent.
Yes. Oh, yes. And the silent part is so important, because the mind wants to go in there and say, yeah, but well, and it's just like, and it was like, if you just allow yourself to not go there, is to not try to figure it out. Because that's the first fall from grace for me, was in the teachings. I was actually having to conceptualize, figure it out, place it in order, do this, do that. And immediately it was like not working. So I don't know. It's just a beautiful, and I feel like you're really being used by the great ordainer, and in actually speaking. Like, you don't have to be silent. You speak a lot, and I want you to speak more, and so that it can move through me, right? So you can be used, and I can receive, and then we have this beautiful relationship where I fall into silence. So just thank you so much, Roger. There's so much richness in what you're doing. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome. And remember, the silence often is the silence of the thinking mind, the silence of involvement. So if we know everything is just happening as it's destined to happen, then the commentary, you know, the resistance, the regret, the blame, then that just dissolves into the silence. The silence is there's nothing to say. It's just happening. So the speaking on the biological level is part of what's destiny, but the silence is the silence of the thinking mind. Yeah, well, thanks. Thank you, Catherine. Well, on that note, it's been a long day. So I wish you all well, and see you in a few weeks' time.